Green Bay Packers fans? Welcome back, and as always, thank you for joining me. My name's Paul Brettel, the site editor over at Dairyland Express, where we cover the Packers, Brewers, Bucks, and Badgers. I also have a new article out every Monday and Friday over at Cheesehead TV. And as it says at the bottom of the screen, wrong way, at the bottom of the screen, you can find me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. So the 53-man roster, or for the time being, the 52-man roster, is set for the Green Bay Packers. Their practice squad is now set as well. So for today's video, I just wanted to discuss some thoughts that I had on that roster, stuff that stood out. Same thing for the practice squad. Wednesday morning over at Dairyland Express, I had an article out with really my 10 quick takeaways from the initial 53-man roster. So I'll run through those for you. Feel free to head to the website as well to check the article out. Admittedly, some of those items are now out of date just because that's how quickly things can change in the NFL. And we learned some new information on Wednesday as well. And then I'll get into the practice squad. Not going to touch on all 16 players, but again, just some of the items that stood out to me. So first, let's dive on in. So the Green Bay Packers decided to keep 5 edge rushers. And one of the questions that I asked was, does that signify the level of concern that there is about Za'Darius Smith's status for week 1? Now, we already know that Matt LaFleur has mentioned that his status is in jeopardy. He could very well miss the first game of the season. Now, if we're looking for a positive in all this, it's that Za'Darius has not been placed on IR. If a player is placed on IR, they're out for a minimum of 3 weeks. So that's good news. They don't see it as being, a month and a half, 2-month injury, and it is a back injury that is, or tightness, stiffness, something along those lines. We all know that backs can be very tricky, but that's what's held him out of practice and basically all of training camp except for one day. So the Green Bay Packers kept the Smiths, Rashawn Gary, Jonathan Garvin, who definitely earned a roster spot, and then Chauncey Rivers, who since coming to Green Bay, he was claimed off waivers, performed really well. It seemed like there wasn't a practice that went by where he didn't make a play or two. So both very deserving. Rivers also saw a good amount of snaps on the special teams unit this preseason. But again, my question is, if there isn't that level of concern about Za'Darius' status for week 1, do the Green Bay Packers just keep 4 edge rushers like they have in the past? So something to keep our eyes on. Another position, the safety position, the Green Bay Packers, they went light. So last year they kept 5 safeties. This year they only kept 4. Christian Uphoff and Innis Gaines, 2 players that we'll discuss here shortly when we get to the practice squad. Either of them were prime candidates. Of all the roster projections out there, there were very few that had the Green Bay Packers keeping just 4 safeties. They had either Gaines or Uphoff on there. Both players flashed. They showed some potential, but especially with Gaines, we saw missed tackles. Uphoff just wasn't nearly as consistent with that playmaking ability. So both players, understandably so, they're young, can use more time to develop. So the Green Bay Packers went light with 4 safeties. My hope for this, or what I'm, trying to read the tea leaves, as they say, is that Vernon Scott's injury, he's been out since the first preseason game. I believe it's a hamstring. Hopefully that means it's not that serious and they expect him to be back. Had he, if this was a long-term injury, again, he would have been placed on IR very likely. So a good sign that he hasn't. He still was not back at practice on Wednesday, but hopefully his return is soon and he will be ready to go for week 1. If that was in jeopardy, I would like to think, or I'd venture to guess, I should say, that Green Bay would have kept at least 5 safeties on the initial roster and more than just 1 on the practice squad. If Scott was in serious jeopardy of missing some time, they had to call someone from the practice squad up just to make sure that there's enough depth there. So just reading the tea leaves, we'll see how it all plays out, but that's how I'm reading the situation at the safety position currently. The cornerback depth, it's thin, to say the least. We know what we have in Jaire Alexander. After that, there's really a number of question marks. Kevin King, we know he's battled injuries. Eric Stokes, there's plenty to like, of course, but he's a rookie. Without a doubt, there's going to be a learning curve and some ups and downs this season. Isaac Yiadom, who the Packers acquired from the Giants when they traded for Josh Jackson, he's just struggled over his first few years in coverage. A solid special teams player, which, again, I'll get to here shortly, but he struggled in coverage. Shamar John Charles really took his lumps this preseason, was targeted 12 times, gave up 10 receptions. So with most of those players, there are legit question marks. Now, as I wrote, that doesn't mean that this unit can't be good, because you could see the flip side of that. If Kevin King's healthy, as we saw in 2019, we saw what he's capable of. Again, Jair's Jair. Eric Stokes, if he continues on that trajectory that he was on in training camp, that improvement, again, there's going to be ups and downs no matter what with a rookie. But if he can steadily climb as the season continues, again, there's a lot of promise there as well. So it's not that this unit can't be good, but there's also the possibility that things could go south as well, outside of Jair Alexander, of course. So just one of the more, intriguing positions to keep our eyes on in terms of how are they going to perform this season. Not quite the biggest surprise cut, because there was another player along the offensive line, but Ben Braden, I was surprised to see that he was cut. Now, looking back on it, as they say, hindsight's 2020, when Matt LaFleur mentioned that Ben Braden was no longer in the running for the starting guard roles, we should have had a little signal in our head going off that something's not right here. And the odds of him at that point being cut likely skyrocketed. And that's what ended up that's what ended up happening. Now, when I put together my my final 53-man roster prediction, I had Braden on the roster, of course. I thought that the versatility that he provides playing both guard and tackle, we know how much the Green Bay Packers covet that. And I thought that he held up decently well at right tackle during those final 2 preseason games. Not someone that you would necessarily want to rely heavily on for an entire season or half the season. But if you need someone to get you by for a few weeks, I thought that he could hold his own. So for those reasons, I thought that he was on the roster. It really never occurred to me that he could be cut. Like I said, hindsight's 2020. That little radar in our head should have went off when he was no longer in the running at guard, but he ended up being cut. Fortunately, the Packers were able to get him back on the practice squad. David Bakhtiari, he was placed on the PUP list, physically unable to perform list, which means he's going to be out for at least the first 6 weeks of the season. As Rob Demovsky of ESPN told us, IR was never an option for Bakhtiari. As I mentioned, IR stays are now only 3 games at the minimum. But to be placed on IR, you must first be on the initial roster. To be on the initial roster, you must pass a physical. David Bakhtiari, since he's still not fully recovered from his ACL injury, was never going to pass that physical. Thus, he could never be placed on IR. So the physically unable to perform list, the PUP list, was the only option for him. So that comes with a 6-week minimum. So he's going to miss at least the first 6 games. Chances are he's going to miss at least 7, and who knows, maybe 8. That 7th week when he can come back, that's probably going to end up being a ramp-up period for him, try to get him back into football shape. So right now, if I had to pick a week to guess when we see David Bakhtiari back, I would venture to say week 8. Now, the biggest surprise, and sticking with the offensive line, Jake Hansen, second-year center from Oregon, former 6th-round pick by the Green Bay Packers, made the 53-man roster. I don't know if there's anyone out there who predicted this. Talk about talk about flying under the radar, having a super quiet summer. The practices that I was at, fortunate enough that I can go to several of them each summer, didn't stand out. I follow along the beat reporters who are live tweeting, articles right after on what took place. Very rarely, or maybe not even at all, was there a mention of Jake Hansen. When the coaching staff is giving their interviews, meeting with those reporters, there were no questions about Jake Hansen. There were no comments about Jake Hansen. It just flew under the radar. And then in training camp practices, in the preseason games, who's at center with the second, third string offenses? Lucas Patrick and Jon Runyan. For the most part, with the exception being that Buffalo game, it wasn't even Jake Hansen. It just, and our lasting image of him, or for what many of us may be, is that final drive before halftime against Buffalo, where he first snaps it low to Jordan Love. The play ends in a sack. And then when the Green Bay Packers are in the red zone, Jordan Love is desperately clapping his hands as the play clock's expiring. Give me the ball, give me the ball. Hansen has no clue. Delay of game happens. This literally came out of nowhere. And this is a prime example of how little we really know of what's going on inside those walls at 1265 Lombardi Avenue. Now, I say all that to say, looking at his numbers from Pro Football Focus, they tend to lean more towards the lean away from the pessimistic stuff that I've just brought up and more towards help illustrate why the Green Bay Packers placed him on the roster. He only gave up 2 pressures this entire preseason. None of them were sacks. His pass blocking grade was the 2nd highest. His run blocking grade was the 8th highest. And overall, among offensive linemen, he was the 5th highest graded one. So I know Pro Football Focus grades are not the be-all, end-all. They need to be taken with a grain of salt. But in this situation, they can help illustrate what it was perhaps that the Green Bay Packers saw that just about all of our eyes didn't see. So major surprise. Big credit to Jake Hansen, who last year was on the practice squad, went to injured reserve, was essentially a redshirt year for him. Definitely, obviously, made the strides to make the roster. This offseason in general, maybe it's just that we are more hyper-focused on the special teams unit, but it also seems like those within the Green Bay Packers organization are as well. And once again, the draft class showed it, free agent signing showed it, and this 53-man roster helps illustrate that as well. Kabion Ento and Innis Gaines, 2 players that many of us, I'll throw myself in there, thought were going to be on this 53-man roster, were left off. And I'm going to guess that a big reason why was because of their tackling issues. Ento and Gaines led the team this preseason in missed tackles. Obviously not a category you want to lead the team in. And for a 5th safety, a 6th cornerback, they're likely not going to see a lot of playing time on the defensive side of the ball. So if they're on the roster, their primary responsibility is special teams. You can't have special teams guys who are struggling with tackling. The Packers went 5 deep at linebacker. Isaiah McDuffie, someone who can contribute to special teams right away. Ty Summers, Oren Burks, plenty of special teams experience over their career. They went with Isaac Yiadom at cornerback over Kabion Ento. Yiadom has almost 500 career special team snaps. Chauncey Rivers, he had one of the higher special teams totals in terms of snaps this preseason as well. So, I mean, you go through the roster. Malik Taylor, he definitely earned it on the offensive side, but don't kid yourselves. He's primarily going to be a special teams player. He had 210 special team snaps last year alone. You could tell, and as it should be, as we all know, this unit has struggled. It's well documented, but you could tell that trying to bolster that unit, beef it up, is absolutely a priority, like I said, as it should be. And expectations, of course, shouldn't be that this unit's going to, be top 10 in the NFL. I think as Packer fans, all we're looking for is something that's competent. Next up, Dennis Kelly. This appears not to be a concern anymore. What I had written was keep your eyes on him as a potential IR move because he had missed so much time and we really didn't know where he stood in terms of his knee injury. Matt LaFleur also did call him questionable for week 1 of the regular season. So I thought that there was the possibility he could be placed in IR. He hasn't been, and he was actually back at practice on Wednesday. So a good sign for the Packers offensive line and some experienced tackle depth. Kurt Benkert, we'll just dive into this one now since he's also on my practice squad list. The Green Bay Packers chose to keep 2 quarterbacks instead of 3, which, as I've discussed, that's the prudent move in all this. For a team that's all in, wanting to win a Super Bowl, that 3rd roster spot for a quarterback can be spent elsewhere and bringing it, and having a 6th cornerback, a 5th edge rusher, so you can get those special teams contributions. But it's absolutely terrific that he went unclaimed and ended up back here on the practice squad. He's a developmental quarterback, but he now has a year in the LaFleur offense to learn it, get a better understanding of it. Being at any practice, let alone a year's worth of practices with Aaron Rodgers, is always going to benefit the individual. And not knowing what Aaron Rodgers' status is beyond 2021, I mean, there is the possibility he's not the quarterback here next year. It gives Benkert the opportunity to step into potentially, he's still going to have to earn it, but to potentially step into a backup role in 2022 behind Jordan Love. So I was really happy to see that Green Bay could get him back on the practice squad. Lastly, again, this one became a moot point as well. I asked if Hunter Bradley was on the hot seat. The Green Bay Packers cut J.K. Scott. They acquired Corey Bojorquez. I think I butchered that, from the Los Angeles Rams. He spent the last 3 years in Buffalo, led the NFL last season in yards per punt, and did so in Buffalo, which we all know is a cold weather climate similar to Green Bay. And that's really one of the bugaboos that got J.K. Scott. His inconsistency especially once we got to November, December, and January within the season. But I also thought that there was the potential that Hunter Bradley could end up cut as well. There was a handful of long snappers that were released on Tuesday, but Brian Gutekunst was specifically asked about Bradley during his press conference and said he's their guy this season. So Hunter Bradley's the long snapper. Don't expect any changes there. Now to the practice squad. I'm just going to touch on some of the additions or non-additions that really stood out. So as you probably heard by now, Reggie Begelton was left off. Equanimeous St. Brown and Juwann Winfree are on at receiver. Juwann Winfree absolutely earned a practice squad spot this year. I know he missed most of training camp with an injury, but when he was on the field, he was making a big catch or two every practice. He was someone who can contribute on special teams as well. When it comes to St. Brown, he was injured again. He's not a special teams contributor. Begelton absolutely outplayed him, but it's the practice squad. Begelton's 28. Equanimeous St. Brown is still 24. On the practice squad, you're going for upside, and they're going to take a swing and can hopefully continue to develop St. Brown, and he can turn into the receiver that they all thought he could. No Dexter Williams. The Green Bay Packers parted ways, and he's already been signed to the New York Giants. 53-man roster. They went with Patrick Taylor. Again, it's upside. We know who Dexter Williams is at this point. Patrick Taylor is a very good fit for this offense. Effective runner at Memphis, solid pass blocker, good pass catcher as well. This was an easy move to make. Packers also keep kicker J.J. Molson. Whatever it is about J.J. Molson, the Packers really like him. He was very solid in training camp this summer with his field goal attempts. He was on the practice squad for half of last year. Despite all these cutdowns until the final one, the Green Bay Packers kept him on the roster despite having Mason Crosby. And Mason Crosby is 37 years old. I mean, there is the potential that an injury could happen. They want to have a kicker that they know on the roster available just in case an emergency situation like that arises. And also, let's point this out, maybe this is Mason Crosby's last season as well. And they like Molson. They want to keep him around for next year to potentially take over. Just absolutely speculating, but I think that's more in play than what some people might think. Ben Braden, who I already touched on, is back on the practice squad. Just terrific news for the Green Bay Packers. Offensive line depth. Going to play both guard and tackle. Kurt Benkert back as well. We already touched on that. Again, an excellent practice squad addition. Chris Blair, wide receiver. He was actually cut when the roster was trimmed from 85 players down to 80. And the Green Bay Packers brought him back to the practice squad. What it is that they like in him so much that they want to bring him back, I'll be honest, I don't know. But there's something there. Abdullah Anderson. So he was signed, I believe it was Thursday or Friday of last week, just before the Buffalo game. And I mean, that was strictly a depth signing along the interior defensive line. Before him, the Green Bay Packers only had 8 defensive linemen on the roster. We knew that a couple of them weren't going to play. Kenny Clark, Kingsley Keke, Tyler Lancaster was out injured. They just needed bodies. But in that limited performance, Anderson showed that he was a strong run defender. And also he does have NFL experience. I believe he has about 150 career NFL snaps. Not a ton by any means whatsoever, but a solid run defender with some NFL experience. There's absolutely value in having a player like that stashed on the practice squad. In an article that I wrote, I compared him to, if you remember last year, Billy Wynn. He was a late summer addition to the defensive line, has way more experience than Anderson does. I mean, that part of it's not comparable, but he ended up playing some snaps during the regular season for the Green Bay Packers in obvious running situations. Who knows? We don't know what's going to happen injury-wise or what's going to take place. Maybe Anderson finds his way to the active roster in that regard as well. The big one, I think the one that is going to be on the radar of many, Christian Uphoff was left off. As I mentioned, there were a number of final roster predictions that had him on the 53-man, and now he's not even on the practice squad. He flashed on special teams. The one thing that I'll add, and as my own observation, whether this is what the Packers were thinking, I'm not sure, because like the Jake Hansen, making the 53-man roster, this is one of those moves that I didn't see coming. So kind of trying to gauge where the Green Bay Packers are with this, it's difficult. But the one thing I will say is that he never, or not, shouldn't say never, but he didn't flash nearly as much as guys like Henry Black or Innis Gaines did. He kind of just floated behind the scenes. And there was that one big special teams play during the preseason, but throughout practices, the other preseason games, I mean, the preseason games, he did struggle defensively. Uh, he just didn't stand out, though, either during practices. And maybe, obviously, that's not the entire reason. It's like anything. There's going to be a number of factors that go into an addition to a cut, whatever the situation may be. But that's one thing that I noticed. He blended in, didn't stand out. So perhaps that was a factor in all of this as well. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on the 53-man roster as well as the practice squad. The Packers have a few more practices before they take on the New Orleans Saints in Jacksonville. So week 1 is not too far away, and Green Bay Packers regular season football is almost here. I'll be back with another video in a few days. As always, until then, take care, stay safe, and go Pack Go.